the whole time this stuff is recording, he's generally blowing weed smoke directly onto the tape and the tape head.
They buried a microphone in a box and literally threw dirt on it while they were singing to give it the image of like burying somebody in a grave.
In some of his like solo songs, he makes reference to the gun that he has in his bag.
You are listening to Tape Spaghetti, a show about the twisted and tangled innards of the music industry. Some of this content may not be for all listeners or viewers, so if it isn't for you, no harm, no foul, we'll just catch you on the next one. All right, without further ado, let's get into this episode. Here we go. Apologies, folks. I just have one quick note. We've been working on this podcast for a little while before we actually launched it, and it originally had a different name. We realized that name was taken, so as you know, because you clicked on this, it is now called Tape Spaghetti, not Riff Session, and so that is why we refer to it as that here a couple times in these first few episodes. But after a while, it'll all smooth out. All right, folks, that's enough. Let's get into it. Hello, everyone. Welcome to just what you've been after, another podcast with my voice on it. That's what everybody has needed. The internet's been clamoring. They've been saying, please, can you speak into microphones more and just put more gibberish out into the ones and zeros? So that's what I'm doing. I'm here with my buddy, Scott Marcourt. We are starting a new podcast that we are calling Riff Session. And unlike every other show I do, it will be not exactly about guitars. We wanted to dive into just other topics that we care about.
What else could there possibly be?
Well, between us, not a lot. I mean, there's a couple right behind you. There's a couple right behind me, and there probably always will be. But just for the people, this is our first episode. We're exploring this. It's kind of happening in real time. We have an idea of how we want to do this. It could take a little bit different forms here and there. But the reason we're doing it is Scott's been on my show, The Tone Mob, 6 times, 7 times. I don't even know. And consistently, every episode, I get messages. They're like, you guys should start your own show. He should come back on more often, etc. Like, you guys have such good rapport. And my response to that is, we better. We talk for hours every single day. So,
and now we can do it while leaving your other podcasts unspoilt by my presence, since there's a nice specific box for me to fit into.
I might drop this into the RSS feed just so people know it exists. Like, not all the time, but the first episode or two, I might be like, hey, go find and subscribe to this new thing that we're doing over here. So hopefully people enjoy it. Should we give you think there's going to be new people finding this that have no idea who we are? Do we need to do some sort of brief history thing? What do you think?
Well, I think we can do like a very, very brief one for the odd person searching on Apple Podcasts who just stumbled across this. So Blake and I know each other because together we run a guitar string company called Stringjoy. I'm here in the offices. Blake's in Portland. I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. And we joined up together on that nigh on 10 years ago and, have developed a beautiful friendship. That goes far beyond just business.
It's actually relevant to the topic that we met on a podcast. So
that's also very true. We met on the Toad Mob podcast. And then, that's the most, I guess, that you really need to know about us. But outside of just, working in business and working in the guitar business, we both are very big fans of music in general, which is kind of what we wanted to do in starting this podcast, is give an avenue for us to just talk about music. And sometimes that might turn into the nerdy side of how music is made with, the gear that goes into that, whether it's guitars or recording gear or stuff like that. But it's kind of our aim here to not get entirely stuck down that rabbit hole, but actually talk about, music in general.
Yeah. And also other stuff.
And other stuff.
Because things are going to come up. If I see a UFO in my backyard, you're going to hear about it on this podcast if I don't get abducted. Or maybe even if I do, if they take me and I can bring a microphone.
Has that happened yet? I know you generally stand out, between the hours of 6 p.m. and 11 p.m. waiting. Has anyone graced you with their presence yet?
You joke about that, but I actually do spend an odd amount of time outside between those hours.
Well, you're a dad, so that's what dads do. You sit out in a chair and look at the art.
Yeah, usually I'm walking around, just walking around the yard, just waiting for that little green light to appear. And it hasn't yet, but I'm waiting. It'll happen.
But you'll hear about it here first, the moment it does, as long as they bring you back.
As long as they bring you back or they have good Wi-Fi.
I guess that's also fair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That'd be really cool. That'd be a whole different background.
Yeah, I think we'd have to change the subject of the podcast entirely. Just like, listen, a new development has occurred. We have to get into this.
We have to talk about aliens now because I am here with them. And,
Vlarp here has, he's actually a great chef. You wouldn't believe it.
I would love to taste some alien cuisine.
Yeah. Well, you've heard of cattle mutilation. That's why it's so clean. They're getting the best bits off.
Oh, that makes sense. That's probably what they come here for. It's just beef. Can't get good beef anywhere else.
We've got good beef. Mars has got terrible beef.
I feel like most of the places where there's a lot of like, abductions and whatnot do happen to be in big like beef areas.
It does seem
like
that way.
The beef belt.
The beef belt.
You use one of those when you do your power lift and squats too, don't you?
You joke, but yeah, quite literally, it is a leather belt. So it is technically a beef belt. Yeah.
Heck yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to be using it later today. And that, my friends, is a great example of when I say other stuff and it's going to go off the rails. Prime example. So we're starting out just
a USDA prime example. It's mostly going to be about beef. We're mostly going to be talking about beef here.
Yeah, I'm also a big fan of beef. Yeah, as you're aware.
I'm a moderate fan of beef.
You're a moderate fan. I'm a big fan.
I'm more of a fish guy, really.
I do love fish. I mean, really, it sounds terrible to say, but if it had a mother, there's a good chance I'll eat it.
That's a good guidepost of whether or not to eat something.
Yes. But today we have actually a subject. We're going to try this. We'll see how this goes. We have a subject, and Scott knows more about it than I do, and we're going to alternate with these things. So the idea is we will start with something and learn some stuff and see where it goes. So what is the subject that we are talking about today, Mr. Marquardt?
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to kind of tell the story. So, just to get it out at the beginning, like this and any other subject that I talk about here, I am not necessarily the world's expert on. So I'm going to reveal everything to the best of my knowledge, but there's probably people out there that know more about this or many other subjects than us. So by all means, feel free to reach out and correct us on whatever it is that we get wrong. But the thing that popped into my head, so it's winter here in Nashville, and I like the seasons. Like I think I would go kind of nuts living in a place that has no seasons, and yet I hate the winter, specifically January and February. Like December when there's Christmas lights out and stuff, that's all great. But as soon as it gets to January, February, I one day I will be a snowbird and live somewhere and play golf in Florida or something in the winter. And boy, let me tell you, I cannot wait for that day. And any day now, as far as I'm concerned. But it hasn't happened yet, so I have to kind of suffer through the cold and the dark. And all of that down here, which something I've realized this year, and I promise I'll get to the subject. I'm on the path.
You're good. No, you're good.
Is that I grew up where it was snowy. I grew up in Indianapolis, and I hated the snow because, again, I hate the cold. But now that I've suffered enough winters down here in Nashville, I've come to learn that when you don't have the snow, the winter's way darker. The snow actually, like, while it's cold, it brightens everything up a lot, and like your eyes, see all that bright white light. And I think that like helps to assuage my seasonal affective disorder. But down here, we don't really have it, so it's just like kind of gloomy and cold, and you can't go outside, and the days are short, and all that. And I hate it. But
welcome to Oregon.
Yeah, so is that just what Oregon's like all the time, except not quite as cold?
Oregon actually has really nice summers. Like it's long. They're getting a little bit longer, and they're really, really pleasant summers overall. It can get really hot, but not Nashville hot.
Yeah,
and that's not a chicken reference, but it is now. I guess. It's not like Texas or something where it's just you go outside. Yeah. It's like dangerous to go outside almost. It's not like that. In Oregon, winters are exactly what you just described. It's just gray gray and wet. And usually it's kind of the worst weather. I mean, I love Oregon, but it's kind of the worst of what you're describing. It's like 38 and raining.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, to me, worse than snowing, because snowing, at least, it's kind of dry-ish. You're not just drenched. If you're working outside in 38 and raining, I feel bad for you, because I did that for years and it's terrible.
It's the worst, the absolute worst thing that could possibly. The only thing worse than being cold is being wet and cold at the same time.
Yes.
Yeah. So
overall, I like the cold. I'm the opposite of you. I'm like, I deal with it because I'm like, get me away from the hot, get me away from the beach. I don't want to ever see sand again.
Oh, see, I love the beach. I love it being hot outside. I love, like, even when it's 93 degrees here in Nashville and like I have the top off on the Jeep, I'm in heaven. I would much rather that than the cold.
Interesting.
So anyway, because of all of these factors, I'm a pretty severe seasonal affective disorder sufferer. Maybe there's a convention or a card that I can hold for that. And so one of the ways that I tend to get around it is I have tropical January and February, where in my media consumption and in my life, I'm consuming tropical things as much as possible to feel as though I am that snowbird that I dream of being. Like I'm rewatching The White Lotus right now just to be like, something warm and vacationy.
Drinking
and so
nothing but Hawaiian Punch.
Yeah. Oh man, I haven't had a Hawaiian Punch in a long time. That's actually a great idea. But so musically, one of the things that I always come back to is I always in January and February listen to a ton of reggae, specifically like Studio One style classics and stuff like that. But kind of all across the board, just because the island music, man, it makes me feel like it's not the middle of freaking winter outside.
I understand. Yes.
And so more recently, I've got a bunch of different like reggae albums and compilations and stuff that I really like. But one that I was digging in on recently that I've liked for a long time is War in a Babylon by Max Romeo. And I actually I was first made aware of this album in kind of an unusual way. So on Jay-Z's The Black Album, which came out back like when I was in high school or something, there's a song called Lucifer, and it's got this really great sample. It's one of like the early Kanye beats. If I remember right, the Jay-Z Black Album, that's when he like retared, quote unquote.
Yes.
But didn't actually retire, obviously. And he like worked with a bunch of different producers for each, like Pharrell and the Neptunes had Change Clothes on it. Rick Rubin came out of like beat production retirement to do 99 Problems, which is sick. And then like there were probably multiple Kanye tracks, but the one that I remember the most was Lucifer. And it's like, Lucifer, son of the morning, I'm gonna chase you out of earth. Kind of like that. Do my best. Yeah. And it's this great cut up. It's just a super great sample that works really well. And so I looked into that back when I was like a teenager or something. And I was like, where the heck did that come from? And it came from this guy, Max Romeo, and specifically this album. And this album's amazing. I think it's like one of the great hallmarks of like mid 70s reggae. That song's called Chase the Devil on this, but it is that Lucifer bit. Okay. And the funny side note on that, I loved the song for a long time. And like the whole kind of like gestalt of the song is, I'm gonna chase the devil out of earth. And it was many years of like listening to that before I was like, I wonder what he means by that. And I was like, oh wait. He means the white devil. He means me. That's what he's talking about.
Oh,
that
awkward.
devil.
Awkward. I don't want to be chased out of Earth, though. But
it's still a great song, and I'm sure he had his reasons.
I'm sure. I am sure of that. Absolutely. I can't say I blame him.
That song is definitely like, I think the standout of the album, but there's a lot of like really great tracks. Like War in a Babylon is fantastic itself. One Step Forward, like all of it's really amazing. It was Max Romeo and the Upsetters that did it. But I was like digging through a little bit more, and I hadn't really realized previously that this record was one of the Lee Scratch Perry produced records, which obviously makes sense. I just hadn't thought too much about it. And that kind of took me into digging a little bit more into Lee, like Scratch Perry and all of his history, which I was familiar with, but was kind of getting myself reacquainted with after a little while. And it's one of what's considered to be the holy trinity of 3 albums of Lee Scratch Perry that he produced, and Scratch is a really interesting guy. So I kind of thought, on this first jump through here of talking about random interesting musical things, I thought we'd talk about Lee Scratch Perry and those 3 albums that I talked about, but also just him in general. And I thought that'd be fun. I should ask, like, at the jump, how much do you know about Lee Scratch Perry, Blake?
So I, of course, and people who know me will not find this surprising at all, my journey to finding out who he was is through a guitar pedal. So
Sure.
I found out about him because I was reading about the Mutron phaser, and he's one of the most he's one of the most famous users of that effect. And I was like, well, I got to know more. And then I realized, I've heard a lot of this over the years. I just didn't really, me not being somebody who follows reggae necessarily, I obviously wasn't super familiar the way I could maybe rattle off some metal producers or something. But it's fascinating to me because, like, what I do know about him is that he kind of just did, from what I gather, he kind of just did whatever he wanted. It wasn't like, the microphone must be placed here and here, and if you have phase cancellation, blah, 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 blah. Like, it was just like, record it. We'll see. We'll just do it however we want, basically. And I love that. It's very punk.
100%. Yeah, that is very much the Lee Scratch Perry thing, which we'll talk about a little bit more. So, really cool guy. Like, he worked as an A&R at some point and did, like, a lot of different stuff in the 60s in Jamaican music. But by the 70s, like, the first thing that I kind of know from him, he did some of the early Bob Marley cuts, like Duppy Conqueror and Mr. Brown. And as a fan of reggae, like, I think Bob Marley is, like, an interesting thing to tackle because I think he's a fantastic musician, but he's one of those people where it's like the fans of Bob Marley kind of like poison the Bob Marley thing itself, Right. Yeah. Like, people talk about Fish and, like, Dave Matthews Band in the same sort of context, where, like, it's obviously fantastic. It's like some of the best music ever made, but, like, no one really wants to, like, you feel like you're like the kid with a Bob Marley poster in their dorm room that, like, smokes a bunch of weed for liking it. But
people generate an idea of a Bob Marley fan in their head, and sometimes it's accurate.
It's usually accurate. Yeah.
But it's kind of interesting how that developed a sort of persona, sort of like an imaginary one or maybe an accurate one. But then somebody who smoked probably even more weed, Willie Nelson, doesn't really have that connotation. I mean, everyone knows he smokes weed, but no one's like, oh, you listen to Willie Nelson, you must be a stoner.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And if those two, I wonder if they did meet, and they would certainly like each other.
Oh yeah.
But, like, the thing is, like, if you're a sort of a casual, like, fan out there of, like, Bob Marley or any of that, most of what you've probably heard is the later Bob Marley stuff. So, like, and this could be an episode all in and of its own, but the earlier Bob Marley and the Wailers stuff is, like, much more traditional Jamaican rocksteady and early reggae and stuff. And then when I'm blanking on his name, but the guy that started Island Records, Chris, I want to say something, when he, like, came to Jamaica and found Bob, his, like, sort of brilliance was seeing Bob Marley and being like, oh wait, I can fuse this with rock and roll and make something that's super palatable to American listeners. And so that's what he did. And, like, all of those, like, later, No Woman, No Cry and all that stuff, those are, like, fairly rock and roll versions of reggae songs that became super popular. But what I think is interesting is, like, the bulk majority of all those sort of famous Bob Marley songs already existed before that ever happened. They were, like, old Bob Marley and the Wailers songs that there exist these, like, much thinner and more roots reggae-ier versions of from when he was, like, more of a traditional roots reggae Jamaican artist, and they just redid them all in nicer studios with different equipment and different kind of styles. But I actually prefer this earlier stuff. Like, Mr. Brown's one of my favorites. That's one I would recommend, and it really does the Lee Scratch thing. If you listen to it, it's got this sort of spooky synth at the beginning and all sorts of weird, crazy noises, very ghoulish sort of reggae music. But anyway, Lee Scratch Perry worked on those, like, some of those, like, very famous early Bob Marley songs. And that's the first stuff that I've heard of from him. But then, after that, he had some success with that, and he ended up building this sort of like legendary famous studio called the Black Ark that existed in Jamaica for a number of years. And that's where he recorded a lot of different stuff. And this whole era is, like I think a lot of great scenes in musical history, it's just one of those times where there were a bunch of different bands and artists that were all really awesome and talented happening at the same time. The music was changing and evolving, and they're all just like hanging out together. Like almost all of these records that I'll talk about, the people that were on one record are on the other records too. Right. They just were hanging out at the studio, and it's like, hey, we need some background vocals. And like everybody that was hanging out would just jump in and do all the background vocals. And I find this like kind of fascinating, that I do think that most sort of legendary musical scenes are emergent from like a lot of different people. Like obviously like the Seattle scene of like the grunge quote unquote era, like, grunge isn't a genre, it's just a scene. Like Pearl Jam and Nirvana don't sound alike. Those are very different bands. They just were buddies and hanging out together. And Alice in Chains too, right? Like that's a whole different thing.
I've always found the lumping of those together, other than the fact that they're all from Seattle and it's all rock.
Yep.
It's like, those bands couldn't be more different. It's really wild that they're kind of blended together in people's brains. But of course, I was a little kid back then, so maybe it makes more sense in the context of the time.
Yeah, I don't think the music industry back in the 90s knew what that was either. I think all they knew was like, hey, every band that we signed from Seattle's getting really big. So let's sign all the other bands from Seattle and see what'll happen. And so you have Stone Temple Pilots and Mudhoney and like all of the bands that existed in Seattle got a deal, and they saw whatever, would happen with that.
Yep.
So very similar scene.
Yeah. In the reggae scene though, like it does seem like it's all this cross-pollination of different people, but it's not a large group seemingly. It's not like, oh, there's 400 people here. It seems like it's a little more tight knit. Is that right?
That's an interesting question. So, I mean, I think that and I would have to do a little bit more research to like know exactly, how many I think, but like the sense that I have from it is that a lot of like the rocksteady and early reggae bands that you hear functioned like Motown bands.
Okay.
So it was like, a whole bunch of singers, like Bob Marley and the Wailers. Like it's like a backing group of singers, and then, a main person, Toots and the Maytals and all this. And then there seemed to be a much more stable group of actual like musicians, like instrumentalists that underpinned them. And again, I mean, same thing was happening in Detroit with Motown as well. Like you have like a pretty core group of instrumentalists that exist behind a lot of that, and it's interesting. That's not the only tie-in with Motown, because the legend of how reggae kind of and early rocksteady and all that kind of came to be was that in Jamaica, they could get AM broadcasts on the radio from the States, because it's not that far away. So they would tune in and they would hear these Motown songs. But because of the distance for those AM waves to travel, and also probably like the quality of speakers that they could use to receive them, you could only hear the top. And maybe this is apocryphal, but you could only hear like the vocals and like the top melodies. You couldn't hear the rhythm. You couldn't hear the bass or the drums.
Oh, interesting.
And so as the legend goes, the Jamaican artists, like they heard these songs, they're like, I love this song. But they had to like guess what the drums and bass would have sounded like, because it wasn't in there. It was almost like an a cappella sort of thing that they were hearing. And in trying to guess what they probably thought was happening underneath these Motown songs, they invented reggae. And you have that like tubby sort of like bass. You have the drums that never hit on the one. They're like always on the backbeat. I'm air drumming for those that can't see. And that, again, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but that's the legend of where reggae came from, was just people trying to guess what was actually happening here, because they couldn't hear it. And so it became influenced by, of course, a lot of like West African music and things that were happening endemic to Jamaica at the time, but came out as like a completely different thing.
I don't think anybody would even really suspect that there was any relation there, but that's a pretty direct line.
Very much so. Yeah. And I mean, it kind of reminds me, I don't know if you've seen those videos they do online of like, so-and-so drummer hears Tool for the first time.
Oh, those are amazing. Drumeo does those. Yeah.
Yeah. And then they'll play him the song without any drums. And then they'll always like, studiously take notes here and then just jump into what they, assume the drums would have sounded like. Those are super fun just to hear how people like interpret these sorts of things.
And impressive.
I do like, I'm not going to call bullshit on it exactly, but it always like comes up with like some super great like jazz or funk drummer that's like been a session guy, for his whole life. And it's like, he hears Enter Sandman for the first time by Metallica. And I'm like,
are you sure?
You gotta tell me this person is like 55 years old. They've been alive all these years on the planet, a professional musician, granted different genre. I get it, but I don't believe they have been sheltered from that song for their whole life.
I'm guessing it's maybe like it has to be labeled as hears for the first time because the internet is the internet and blah 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 blah. But it's probably more accurate to say, if I had to guess, that they are analyzing it for the first time.
Yeah,
maybe you've definitely heard these songs before.
Who was it? There was one, it was like a hip hop drummer that like had never heard Smells Like Teen Spirit or something.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you've heard Smells Like Teen Spirit.
Yeah.
There's no way you haven't heard that song. There's no way you escaped the 90s, much less like the decades to follow, without knowing that song fairly intimately. Well, I know all sorts of music I wouldn't choose to know. That's just around.
It's there. Yeah. There was another one too, but the one that was like believable, was it Chad Smith from Red Hot Chili Peppers? He definitely was on an episode, but not to sidetrack too much into this, but I think I think it was a more believable one. It's like he hears Polyphia for the first time or something.
Okay.
I'm like, they're a big band, but they're pretty new. I could see how that has escaped you. That would make sense to me. But yeah, I might be getting that mixed up with somebody else, so don't quote me on the exact people or band. But they do have some very believable ones, I would say.
Yeah, and I think it's unique to rhythm that it works. Like, I mean, I would love to hear like Tom DeLonge hears Handel's Messiah for the first time. And scribbles a few notes and then jumps on in there and
Lars Ulrich hears Honky Tonk Badonkadonk for the first time.
That one, I believe that would be amazing. Yeah, but anything with notes would be a little bit more difficult. Though some people totally can just hear it and then play it right back, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah, I don't have that bone. Can't do it.
But I guess that wouldn't be it. It would be the reverse. It would be like, okay, you only hear the drum and bass for Honky Tonk Badonkadonk, and then you just have to guess what it sounds like on top of that.
If you could hear the drum and bass, that would actually probably be one of the easier ones. That
one would be doable.
Yeah, but like Enter Sandman would be hard. You're not going to get that same riff. You're going to play something totally different. Yeah,
not at all. Yeah, yeah. I don't know.
You'll do something, but it probably won't be the same. But
no.
Anyway, we should try it sometime.
Yeah. But so anyway, reggae music came about in this sort of way. And so yeah, as we were pulling it all back,
yes,
more of like a tighter group of musicians and instrumentalists, and then I think a larger group of singers. But Jamaica's not a huge place, so there's not that many people to begin with, compared to like the UK or something like that. I would presume. So you have a lot of like shared stuff happening here, right? And a lot of these people are kind of similar.
While you're telling this story, because I'm curious.
I would be very curious to know before I say that it's like smaller than the UK, because it could be hyper populous.
I'm gonna find out. Go ahead and keep telling the story. I will Google for you.
Yeah, you're all good. So anyway, Lee Scratch Perry starts this studio called the Black Ark and starts recording a bunch of different people. And like, a lot of there's great moments from like the entire run of the studio, but in my and much of the internet's opinion, it kind of peaks in the late 70s. It looks like you found the population.
I did. In 1970, it was about 1.8 million people. So
okay, so that's not a ton of people. That's
I think, and the UK, I should also have figured out what UK was in 1970.
I think the UK is like 30 now or something. But like 1.8, 1.9, that's like a moderately sized United States city.
Yes.
Is kind of the whole place. And this is mostly happening in like, Kingston and its suburbs.
The population of the United Kingdom, according to Google, in 1970 was 55 million.
Yeah, that's a lot bigger.
That's a lot. So your estimation was very accurate.
So let me talk through like these 3 albums and then kind of talk about the story of the studio and Lee and how he worked and all this, just to kind of like put them out there for those that want to jot them down. So Max Romeo's War in a Babylon, I already talked about. I think that's an amazing one. I think it's probably the cleanest of all of them. And it makes me wonder if they went to a different mastering engineer or something, because we'll talk about it, but it's not, this type of music is not characterized by being super like slick and clean. But the second one, because I decided to listen through these last week, was Junior Murvin's Police and Thieves. And I knew a couple tracks off this.
Yes.
But I did not know the entire record. Police and Thieves probably sounds familiar to you. Can you guess why?
I know exactly why. Because of The Clash.
Exactly. Yeah. So The Clash picked up the title track on this record and made a very famous cover, which is a part of a whole thing that happened in the late 70s. Like UK artists, every UK artist had to do like a reggae song, at least, if not a whole album. Like you had Eric Clapton's whole I Shot the Sheriff bit. A lot of the new wave stuff, like Elvis Costello always kind of flirted with it. The entirety of The Police is just them, like a couple of white guys trying to do like a faux reggae.
Yeah, and a ton of The Clash, like not just that, but a ton
of The Clash.
And I love The Clash.
The Stones, though it's less notable, were kind of doing some of this at this time. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards moved to Jamaica for a long time and were hanging out with all these same people. So it was a hugely influential thing, especially in the UK. Because, I mean, Jamaica is still part of the Commonwealth of UK nations. And at that point, I'm not sure if they had independence or not yet. But it is, effectively a part of the crown. So this is happening on their soil, and the feedback loops were really there. So Junior Murvin's Police and Thieves, great record, by the way. Like I really love the first track on it. It has this very bouncy rhythmic thing that's happening, and he has this cool falsetto. He's fairly high for one of these singers at the time to be singing in falsetto like that. Great record all around. The third one was one that I will admit I just like learned of in this past week when I was reading about this, and it's the Heptones Party Time. The Heptones were like an old rocksteady band that existed in Jamaica for a very long time at this point. So this is more seen as like one of those kind of like later career peaks that bands have. Like when Aerosmith like suddenly had like Pink in the late 90s. You're like, oh, they're still doing it. Look at that.
They're crushing it. Wow.
This one's like a little newer to me, but also a great record. Crying Over You is like one of my favorites from it. I really, really enjoy it. But and this is a bit of an aside, but it's relevant. I disagree with whoever put this as the third album in this Holy Trinity.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, because there's one to me that's better. It's a great record, like no shade in it at all. But to me, the Congos, Heart of the Congos, is the record. I think it's actually the best record he made in the whole studio. The song that you'd know is it goes, row fisherman row.
Oh yeah, that's a great song. Yes.
And an old song that preceded the record, but the take on it is really, really unique. And this is like that I think is his masterpiece, and the thing that's the most exemplary of what he does. And so while I want to talk more about that record, I want to come back to it. Go ahead.
Quick question. So who is, I know that it can be difficult to pin some of this down, but sometimes it comes back to like an individual journalist or some person or some outlet that coins these things, like the Holy Trinity. Where did this idea come from? Obviously,
that's a great question. Probably the internet in the 2000s.
Yeah. But where did this label come from for these records?
Probably a bunch of music geeks on internet forums over time that have kind of developed for it. Yeah, there's nothing like I don't know. And I mean, Pitchfork would probably agree with the Congos record if I had to guess, being included. I think that's the masterpiece of all the Lee stuff. But let's come back to that after talking a little bit about it. So Lee Scratch Perry himself, what I haven't dove into too much is what makes him such a unique character. So for one, to just like kind of put it out there, with no disrespect intended, the guy's kind of a nut.
Is he one of those? Let me guess, just because I've noticed a trend with brilliant but eccentric producers. We'll put it that way. Did he involve firearms in the studio at any point?
I don't know, but I know that he in some of his like solo songs, he makes reference to the gun that he has in his bag.
Okay. All right.
So it wouldn't surprise me.
Just saying, I've noticed that be a thing, and I'm not saying it's a good thing, but I've noticed that is a thing amongst producers of the time who are noted for being amazing, but also kind of whack jobs.
Yeah, he was, but also brilliant. And I kind of want to talk, later about how those things interplay. Mm-hmm. But so the Black Ark itself, so the studio that he builds, it's small, it's kind of dark. He paints the walls black. He scribbles all sorts of like weird sayings all over the walls and things that just like come up to him at the time. Like at some point, it's just like covered in scribbles of nonsensical things. He's nailing all sorts of stuff to the walls, like various roots and shrubs, notably, and other general items and things. He thinks of it, I think, as a sort of spiritual temple. Okay. As much as a studio. And it's sort of bare bones in terms of like the gear side of it himself. Like he used this TAC 4-track recorder, notably, even while like some more multi-track recorders existed at the time. And then very famously, as you mentioned, he used this Mutron biphase, which is this big box that creates this swooshing sort of phasing sound. Mm-hmm. And he would like constantly, as he's recording stuff, he's just like riding that thing. He's just like playing with the knobs live in real time on live tracks that are coming in to control that. He's using a lot of reverb and echoes and stuff like this that are all coming from bus sends to sort of create this sound. And so
For
what he would do,
less nerdy of us, a bus send.
Oh yeah, okay. So we're
trying to talk to more than just our normal people as best we can.
He's sending things like the drums and the bass, and in groups sometimes of those different stems of different instruments out of the mixing desk to these various effect processing rigs and things.
Yeah.
That
this is going to be challenging for us to not just use our own language. All the time.
No, I appreciate you mentioning it. Just adding all these sorts of crazy sounds to it, and that's not really like the end of it either, because what he would do is he'd record the band. He'd start with the drums and the bass, and then eventually would add in sometimes some guitar or organ, and then of course like the gang vocals and everything. But something that he did, and maybe it precedes him, but he's like kind of the first guy that I know of, is he's running around recording all this other crazy weird shit from around. He'd be breaking bottles in front of a microphone. He famously like buried a microphone beneath a palm tree and banged on the palm tree to create like a kick drum sound.
Wow. I love that.
Yeah, and was doing all this sort of crazy stuff, just adding all these weird textures in the background of the music. And when you listen to his music, like to really get it, you have to turn it up really loud, because some of this stuff's just like buried deep in the back of the mix. But on top of that, I mentioned the 4-track. So like for the uninitiated, on a 4-track recorder, you've got 4 different tracks, different instruments that you can like put down all at once. And that would not be enough to make like a really great record all on its own. So what you do is you record, say, 4 of them, and then you mix them down to just 2 of those tracks. So you record all 4 of the tracks down to 2, and now you've got 2 more tracks. Mm-hmm. And there's a few different ways of doing this, but it's something like that. And then you add on, these other tracks. What's interesting about that is that you get these sort of tape artifacts, because you're recording on the same tape over and over again.
Right.
And constantly, we call it bouncing, 4 tracks down to 2 tracks, and then adding some more and adding some more.
Because the recording device only can record 4 tracks at a time. So you have to make these sacrifices. Versus today, where we can have as many tracks going at the same time as we want, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. Anyone out there who's seen like a picture of a recording studio where they have this massive 12-foot long desk with faders that they can adjust, this is not that. This is a tiny little rig that he's using to kind of record onto. And on top of that, he would do a lot of interesting things with the tape. So for one, the whole time this stuff is recording, he's generally blowing weed smoke directly onto the tape and the tape head as it's going. But beyond that, he would take the tape, he would bury it in the dirt outside of the Black Ark, and then bring it back in and then record on it. Allegedly, he would put blood onto the tape. He would urinate onto the tape sometimes.
Jeez.
A little unsavory. But he'd do all sorts of this crazy
I like that.
stuff.
That surprised me more than the blood. That's something's wrong.
There's
with
something
me.
about it that bothers me more than the blood. I think. I don't know
I can
why.
imagine I can imagine accidentally cutting myself and then touching it.
Yeah.
Versus you have to very intentionally do the other thing. So
Yeah, it's probably not an accident necessarily. So he's doing all this stuff, and like the smoke fills this place. Like from all the reports, like there's just like sort of scuzz and buildup on everything.
I'm sure
from what people have talked about, like there's just like dirt and shit around all over it, and generally people are like, this is part of the sound of that. Like everything that comes out of this place sounds kind of dirty. It certainly doesn't sound crisp. It doesn't sound like a Pink Floyd record. It's very saturated and dirty and grainy and weird, but in this really super great way is the thing. And so, you know, he was an eccentric to a fault. Like in his later years, he dyed his hair and his beard red, and
all right,
because why not? He would wear all sorts of crazy getups. He would stop people in the middle of recording to give some sort of impromptu sermon. Again, they were all super high at all times in this period in the 1970s. But he, and I think the other musicians that recorded there, felt like as he would describe it, like the spirituality that was happening, he felt kind of created these ghosts in the machine and really like informed how the music would sound coming through the actual tape recording. I don't know that there's any, you know, physical evidence for that effect taking place, but it's how he felt. And it's difficult to deny.
If you have, you know, any kind of spiritual leaning, it's hard to imagine that there's, you know, there's just things, there's art that gets produced and you're like, that has a feeling to it. It's different. It's technically the same as this other thing, but this other thing isn't the same. And I wonder if I kind of think there's different versions of injecting that ghost into the machine. And that is certainly one way to do it. If you were going to do it, that would probably work.
Yeah. And at the very least, like it's going to affect the way people are playing and the way people are singing and all that.
Absolutely.
So like, you know, I would describe it as like kind of witch doctor vibes in the studio itself.
That's what it sounds like.
But it made these really, really cool records. And so when I'm talking about like the Congos record, which I would highly recommend as like even a starting place for people, there's just all this stuff happening. It's some of it intentional, some of it unintentional. You have like a drum being suddenly fed out to this reverb or like tape delay machine and then coming back way too loud. It's like a Jackson Pollock painting or something, you know, it's not formally correct. Like the drums don't stay the same volume the whole time. Nothing really does. It's all kind of moving and shaping, and suddenly there's a phaser on it. Suddenly it's way too saturated and dirty. And then it comes back. And it really kind of evolves in this way. And that's kind of the interesting thing, because at this point, even before it's kind of done, Scratch is like, I think one of the first people playing the studio like an instrument. Like you have the sound of the band in a room, and then you have the sound after this guy is adding all these crazy effects and processors and, you know, playing this 4-track and his console that fed into it like a piano in many ways, just suddenly being like, boom.
Yeah.
And that goes so far.
He's getting inspired almost as a musician.
Yeah.
He's going
completely as a musician. And that's the interesting thing is like in this process, he actually creates him and King Tubby, create this genre called dub or dub reggae, which exists as like an entirely new art form wherein the producer becomes the musician. So as one example, that song Chase the Devil from Max Romeo, like immediately after he records that song with Max Romeo, he makes this remix of it as we would call it now, though I don't know that they really had that terminology. But in this, the vocals are kind of cut up and like only coming up, here and there. The tempo overall is a little bit slower. There's a ton of reverb and delay happening like right on the drums and on the bass. And these soundscapes that suddenly like well up and grow and get bigger and bigger and then shrink back down. And this is an entirely new concept. This is wild, of just like somebody coming in, taking these pre-recorded tracks and then making music by playing the tracks into different effects and things like that.
Is this the first time that anybody's really done like an early form of DJ work, basically?
Yeah, and that was kind of happening too. Like it wasn't. I'm curious how those like timelines overlap, because it's pretty close to where like people in New York are starting to like scratch records and stuff.
Okay, but I was thinking it was before. So
I think it would have been, especially with like King Tubby and stuff.
Okay,
but yeah, you have this like brand new concept basically of a producer being an artist in their own right, and it being like, this is a song, and then there's this other song that uses all the same elements of that song, but via effects and stuff is a completely different song now, which is super cool. And Scratch and a guy named King Tubby, who's also amazing, really like pioneer this sort of thing. So I think like one of the great hallmarks of Lee Scratch Perry is like showing that a producer is a musician too.
Yes.
When you go back in time,
some people are a little more hands off, and
Rick
Rubin,
they're not all.
The aforementioned, like he's very open about the fact that he's not. Even though I would make an argument with some of the things he's done, I'm like, meh. Is beat making a musician? I'm like, to me it is.
Yeah.
Some people don't consider it that, and I think they're kind of wrong. It's its own art form. So he even says, he's like, I'm not a musician. I'm like, well, you kind of are though. So maybe that's not even a good example of what I'm saying.
No. I completely agree. And I mean, and when you go back in like studio production history, these guys are called audio engineers, but like the original audio engineers are like engineers. They're wearing white coats.
Yes.
in the control room. And they're very much not like, hey, make that piano sound more earthy, man. Yeah. They're very much speaking in frequencies and like
what
controlling.
What decibel do you want me to turn it up, and in what frequency range, and give me that, not like, make it juicy, brother.
Right. They could draw you like a schematic of how a compressor works and like the math behind it and all of that sort of stuff. But they're thinking of it in this way. And so by the time you get to hear, and obviously this changes with George Martin and people, even earlier than Scratch, but I think he's a big part of that evolution of producers not having to be scientifically correct, right, in terms of how to record it. And in many cases, he's specifically not. He's like overloading inputs to get distortion on the front end of things. Or like specifically, there's this reverb unit. I forget what it's called that he would use. I think I wrote it down here.
I was gonna say I'll Google if you want to talk about it.
Oh yeah, the Fisher Space Expander was a popular one. He used an RE201 Space Echo, but the Grampian Spring Reverb was one of the ones he would use, and that's what Pete Townsend would use. Turn the reverb off and overload the inputs to create like a sort of fuzz sound.
All right, to get a little gear nerdy, I have a Premier reverb unit that was made in New York back in the 60s or whatever, and that's one of my favorite things. It's like, this thing's a great overdrive pedal.
Yep. Exactly. And I don't know if they all found this out independently, but Scratch would do the exact same thing. He would overload the front end of that and make these reverbs. So I mean, you're very much like abusing the gear to do not what it was made to do. Yes. But something that sounds really great, in and of itself. So, I think that all of the like all that dub stuff is very cool. That's kind of a bit of an acquired taste if it's not something that you've listened to before. It's funny because that genre, now you hear like they call it like slowed with reverb on the TikTok, which is literally like dub basically.
Yes.
just an unplayed version of it where it's just like a standard, it's this slow and with this much reverb going through. But that's what's kind of happening. And it was created very much in the 70s in Jamaica.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, too, because you get the image of this guy in this crazy shack, probably not too different from where I'm standing right now, except that it's all black. Just thinking about these things, and you wonder if how much of it was him intentionally like, this is going to sound great, versus I'm going to turn that knob and see what it does. Whoa, it does that. I'm going to do that again.
Yeah.
I wonder like what his actual thought was, because, when you're that high and I don't know if there's as much intentionality behind it, as much as there is just inspiration to start messing with stuff.
Yeah. And this is, I think, the thing that's the most difficult for me to unpack with like Scratch's legacy is that these are like legendary records. Certainly, like they're legendary musicians that were around at the time too. So that has a big part of it. It's not like he found these people on the streets and just like invented it all out of nothing. But it certainly worked out really well. But yeah, I don't get the sense that like there's all that much intentionality around it. I think it is just like this emergent, I turned this knob, this did this thing. I'm going to remember to do that again next time. And that's fine. But some of it, it's like, if you take like, as just one example, like I'm going to take this tape, I'm going to bury it in the yard and I'm going to bring it back and then play it through. That's not a thing where you can be like, I wonder what that would sound like. Maybe it's better, maybe it's worse. I'm going to bury it, bring it back. Ooh, I didn't like that. Or like that added some low mid range, but I'm going to go back. Once you've done that, you've committed. All of the performances are on the tape up to that point.
And I have to imagine too, that studio wasn't rolling in such a budget that they could just afford tape, It didn't work. We're going to throw that in the garbage. No, we're using it.
Yeah, exactly. And so it just feels like a lot of it is kind of this like devil may care, like, let's just do it and then maybe it'll be good or maybe it'll be bad, sort of thing,
I said it in the beginning about something else, but it all feels, I think the reason I was kind of into the story of this guy without really even being as familiar with the music was like, this just speaks to my punk rock self. Like, it feels very punk. Like, I don't know, throw it in the ground and see what happens. Let's smear some cigarettes on it too. Like, we're just going to do it. And I love that.
100%.
Mm-hmm. If my teenage me would have probably like found, if I knew about him at the time, I probably would have like devoured every book about it, because I think that kind of stuff is just so interesting and kind of foreign in this day and age.
Yep. Yeah. He's a fascinating character. And I mean, like the sound that kind of came out of it, whether intentional or not, is this very spooky, ghoulish sort of sound. A lot of it's like kind of dark, and there's these weird like echoes. It sounds like you're walking into a haunted forest or something in some ways. And once he started doing that, just everyone wanted a part of it. Paul McCartney went to Jamaica to record with him, and I'm not actually sure what came out of that exactly. I should have looked that up. But he worked with a lot of interesting people, and his story kind of continues from there. But so what happens is, after like these and a bunch more records, he gets really popular again. Like I said, Paul McCartney, other like UK artists are like flying out there to see what's going on and try to get that magic. And this is where the things get a little controversial about exactly what happened.
Okay.
What we know is that the Black Ark burned down in like the late 70s, early 80s, and was no more. What is unknown is exactly what happened. So Lee Scratch Perry claimed that he burned it down himself. He claimed that there were too many sort of bad ghosts that were around. Some people think he was talking about all the people that were suddenly hanging around, like the Suits and various like, music industry people or richer musicians that were kind of crowding it out. He's also in this guy, he says different things in different interviews.
Sure.
He talked about how much like sort of gangs and like the sort of Jamaican mob got involved, like gangsters got involved in all this and were hitting them up for protection money and stuff like that. Throughout his entire like career, he always had a lot of different disputes over royalties. He never really like got what he felt that he was like promised from different arrangements. So there's like a lot of different stuff going on that sort of led to him just like dousing the thing in gasoline and walking away. But some other people suggest that it might have been like an insurance thing where it burned down. Some other people say that it just burned down on its own and he was like, maybe cognizant of his own sort of legend, thought it'd be a heck of a lot cooler to say that I just like torched the whole place and walked away. I'm not really sure.
I would believe any of those things.
Yeah, and maybe all of them.
Maybe all. Actually, I mean, I could totally envision a world in which every bit of that story is true, except the discrepancy is, did he burn it? Like the only real discrepancy is, did he burn it down on purpose or on accident? But I could see all of the other things being accurate.
And it's very possible that no one remembers.
Why wouldn't they remember, Scott? I don't understand. Wasn't everyone very clear-headed and focused at the time?
That is the sense that I get, that they might have been like, what happened last night? I don't know.
I don't know, but the studio's gone.
The studio's gone.
Scratch.
And so
Scratch. The studio's gone. I did it.
Yep.
Are you sure
probably
you did
me?
It? No, I'm sure that I did.
Yeah, and he has this sort of scratchy voice, like Red Fox, Sanford and Son thing about him.
Oh
as
yeah,
well.
like a kind of.
He's like, hey, and he's always
that.
talking about spirits and shit. So I mean, it can be a little bit difficult to decipher exactly what was happening. But like, from here, for the kind of the rest of the story for him, he continued being a musician after this, but like wasn't really producing as much. And weirdly, I mean, a lot of those artists, like, there's not like a number 2 Max Romeo like album that's like comparable in a lot of ways. Like these peaks were like they had other singles and stuff, but these peaks that happened in like this 76, 77, 78 era were kind of like true peaks for all of them, as best as I can kind of tell. Outside of like the headtones that have been around for a long time. And and Bob Marley at this point is like, more of a, I mean, I'm certain he's not like in Jamaica all the time. He's touring the world,
right?
He's kind of out of it and has broken out. And and Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer and a lot of these people that are connected to Bob Marley and the Wailers, they kind of go on to have their own lives and careers. But it's interesting, and Scratch continues mostly existing as like a musician after this. He doesn't really produce much after this era, and he's around for a long time. In fact, he just passed in 2021. In his like mid to late 80s. Wow.
Yeah. He preserved himself.
He sure did. And he was touring in like the 2010s and 2020s. And there's some cool old, not old, I guess more recent. There's some cool, more recent recordings with like an older Scratch. He's mostly a vocalist in these and is kind of doing like a sort of rap thing. That's happening. It's fun. It's bouncy. It's tubby. He worked with a bunch of different producers because after he burned down the studio, or it burned down, he moves to London and New York and Switzerland and all these different places. But in the UK, again, he's like a legend. All of these like producers that are starting to work in like sampling or electronic music and stuff like this, he's a legendary dude. So they all want to have him over to hang out with at the very least, and collaborate. So he had kind of a long arc and career after all that. And I mean, and this stuff was super influential. Ironically, like, while influential in reggae, I think that it's the influence of like the 70s Lee Scratch Perry stuff is more felt in other places. Like Animal Collective, it's a band that I love that's using all of these crazy found sound samples and little, a crinkle of a rappers appearing at this one point in the song. That's all calling very much back there to the 70s. Obviously, all of dub. A lot of hip hop, with these like the beats and the heavy bass, like a lot of this stuff is coming out of this like sort of influential goo, primordial goo that existed in the 70s, and is coming out of it, which I think is super cool. And also, probably a lot of weirdo, super brilliant, genius producers, owe some influence to this era as well.
Yeah, you have to imagine. I mean, when you were talking about him banging on the tree with the mic in the box, well, I'm immediately thinking of course, because I always am. I'm even wearing the sweatshirt right now. One of the things that influenced me the most in recording was hearing when Thrice recorded their Alchemy Index record. I was reading about it because I'm a huge fan of that band, and they buried a a microphone in a box and literally threw dirt on it while they were singing to give it the image of like burying somebody in a grave.
Oh,
and I was like, well, that's cool. I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah, that's amazing.
There are no rules, but that came directly from that, whether they knew it or not, but they probably did. That comes from that.
Yeah, and it's all, the Beatles were doing crazy stuff in the 60s too, in a very different way. But yeah, like I'm always fascinated by these, like the studio innovator sort of people that are not like the guy on the album exactly, but have like worked up their own very distinctive sound. And I mean, a lot of them, like Lee, like Martin Hannett, who did like the early Joy Division stuff. Like,
oh yeah,
these guys are like kind of crazy by most people's like understand. Like a lot of them are either very difficult to get along with or like just kind of nutty. And I don't know what it is that just kind of works,
Mm-hmm. I wonder if part of it is when somebody is that kind of wild and you're confronted with working with this person in some capacity. I mean, in my old jobs, I've been with some crazy people that you get to a point you're like, all right, dude, that's not how you do that, but it seems to be working for you. So I'm going to let you do that because you're kind of insane and it's harder to talk you out of it than it is to just let you do it and let it happen.
Yep.
Because you're that wild. I've worked with some very interesting people in my days, and I'm kind of just saying like that can have its own form of brilliance at times where you're like, you're wrong like 80% of the time, but the 20% of the time you're right. It's so awesome.
Yep. And I think another thing that happens in music in particular is that if you take, some kind of off the wall person and they happen to have like one record that really punches through by whatever means possible, it just all kind of worked. And maybe these people had no one else to record with. I don't know, but like it worked and it was a great record. After that, bands always seek out, or artists seek out somebody to record a lot of times because they're like, I really loved what they did on this record. And once you do that, then they're just like, well, however he works is how he works. All I know is I like the result that he got from this. Right. So I'm like, I'm here for it. Just do whatever you want to do, man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll just play the thing. If you think I need to put a microphone inside my ear for some reason, then I guess that's what we're going to do.
Yeah. And it's worth noting too, in Jamaica in particular, there's more of a limitation, especially in this time. There's not that many studios.
Sure.
There's not a lot of options.
One of 4 studios, maybe being generous on the whole island. Like, I don't know.
Not a lot. Like I know Island Records had like a studio and like you wouldn't just walk into there. And that's part of it too. Like, I can't imagine that he was charging a ton of money necessarily to record here. It's not like going into some super nice clubby music studio that feels really great. So, and that's part of it too. And I mean, to this day, you like in a lot of Jamaican music, one thing that I enjoy about Jamaican music is that you have this separation between the song and the rhythm, or the rhythm, if you will, RIDDIM, where you have, when a producer comes out with like a rhythm, like a beat, basically, multiple artists will use that same beat. In like American music, we think of that as like, interspersed with the song. It's not quite the same way in Jamaica.
Is it still that way, or was it that way at the time? Because
no, it's still that way.
Oh, it is. Okay.
So like, yeah, back when I should have written this down, but back in like the mid 2000s, there was one summer where there were 3 different songs. There was a Sean Paul song. There was a song by Kevin Little. And there was another one that all used the same rhythm that were all punching through on American charts at the same time.
Oh, weird.
That like you had to kind of really listen to be like, oh, that's the exact same beat. It's just a whole different take on it that was happening. So yeah, this still occurs to this day because there's not as many producers, and there's a lot of people that make music. So it's a very thing like you make a beat and that's your beat and you have it, and then anyone can use it after that, and they're separate. They're just separate things.
It also, as a producer, it really increases your chance of punching through.
Totally. Yeah. If I make a beat, unless I'm getting a ton of money, I'd love to have a bunch of different people shoot their shot on it and see who does the best job.
Oh yeah, 100%. That's why we were talking about trying to come up with some theme music for this here podcast, and I was like, I've got like hundreds of 30-second tracks that maybe one of them will work. Or maybe I'll have to make another one. We'll find out, but TBT. But I love repurposing them. I've repurposed them on different reels for different people that like where the music, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but it's not central to whatever is happening, but it needs something in the background. I'm like, Metal Chugs? I got a track for that. Metal Chugs 1 through 40. Which one do we want?
A symphony, if you will.
Yes. But I get it. Like if you've already done a bunch of work, and again, back in those days, tape, you're literally physically limited by tape. We don't have that. We don't even think about that anymore.
Yep.
So maybe that producer could only afford to have a few different beats, and it's like, hey, do what you will with these. This is what I got.
Yeah, and you're not wrong. I mean, there's a cost to data sort of back in this era that doesn't exist anymore. Of like the literal tape to record something costs money, and it costs money to like store that tape instead of rewriting it for something else.
People think of it maybe like cassette tapes. It's not. It's really expensive, and if you screw it up, it's a bad thing. So that's why it's so crazy that he was burying it.
Yes. Yes, it is a little bit wild.
It's like hundreds of dollars at least. I mean, I haven't priced it in a long time, but my band and I were going to record through tape at one point, and we went, nah, we'll just go ahead and run it through when we're done.
That's what a lot of people do these days. Yeah.
It's too expensive.
But I think the thing that to any sort of non like super gear nerds out there, like the thing about recording to tape back in the day too, is that it's difficult to press the undo button with tape.
Almost impossible. You're re-recording it.
You're re-recording it, or I mean, people got really good at using razor blades to splice and cut, and literally like when they used to make like a splice of like a lead vocal, they would literally take a bunch of takes and then cut up all the tape and tape them together to get like the best, version of each little phrase.
Yeah.
We just don't have that anymore. And in that era, I mean, like there's literally a price, like from a business perspective, a singer that can go in and give you a great take all the way through costs you way less.
Even if they're a more expensive singer.
Yeah, exactly. They're just going to get it right, and you're not having to pay all these engineers to cut it up and do all this crap to find the perfect sort of take.
Yeah, I'm guessing probably not at the Black Ark, but in like bigger studios, if you go back and look at some of this stuff, this is again for the less nerdy among us. There's literally like specialized tables and razor blades and like equipment for doing this physical cut of tape, which just almost never occurs anymore.
Yeah, it's a major thing. And if you like totally cut wrong, you screwed the whole thing up.
Yeah.
And then you have to redo it. And that's all of the studio musicians, and they're all in a union, and that costs a lot of money. Like it was a machine, and there's good and bad elements of that, I think. But, back in the day with this style of recording, you have like a business need to be like, we need all of these musicians to be able to like nail it.
That's why the Wrecking Crew existed. That's why all of the Motown people got the call over and over and over again. It's why there's like big studio musicians in Nashville at the time, because even if you could afford to redo it all, you don't want to.
Right.
Why?
Right. And that's what's so cool, I think, about this era of like Jamaican music is like, yes, the players are that good and are doing a great job, but also they're comfy with weird mistakes and vibes and stuff. And this is an era where Steely Dan's already out, and Pink Floyd's doing so. Like there's like perfect music, quote unquote, that exists, a couple 100 miles away in the States, and that's really not what's being gone after in this era. And I think it's just really cool for all of those artifacts and all of that vibe. It feels like a world that you're stepping into when you listen to some of these records.
Yeah, you can almost picture the studio. If you just close your eyes and you're like, okay, I'm here. I can smell the weed smoke.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, that's me.
I did for some further reading and listening for people out here that check this out. So again, those 3 records I would recommend diving into. My top recommendation is what led me here. Max Romeo War in a Babylon's a super accessible one, even if you're not like into all the crazy weird recordy stuff. The Congos, Heart of the Congos, similar, but there's a lot there for anyone. Like you can really unpack. Headphones are great for these. Junior Mervin's Police and Thieves, fantastic. The Heptones Party Time, also fantastic. Bunch of other great stuff from Lee Scratch Perry as a solo artist and different collaborations and things like that. For people that want to get super nerdy, there's this great article on sound in Sound on Sound. It's Lee Scratch Perry and Daniel, what's his name? Daniel Boyle, where Daniel Boyle, much more recently, this is about like 2015, a UK producer, worked to reconstruct all of the gear that was used in the Black Ark to record with Lee Scratch Perry. Yeah, he details all of it, like how he put it all together, how he found it. He talks about like when Lee came in to record with him, he also like nailed like a shrubbery on the wall. So he's still doing that. Would recommend. And then also kind of for anybody, if you just search Lee Scratch Perry, like Black Ark or recording studio, there's like a 4-minute video that, like all of the old British videos, there's always like a narrator who's like, here they're making authentic reggae music. It's that. It's exactly that. Just like the old wildlife videos. That sounds
more like the 1930s.
They didn't change it much, I don't think. But so there's one of those. It's about 4.5 minutes, and it's him recording some of the Heptones of different people, and I think Junior Mervin's in there too. And you can just see him in there riding the mixing console, and he's got this Mutron biphase that he's just cranking.
Man, I gotta
like
watch
right
that.
right on the live take. Like as much as they're printing the musician's performance, they're printing like him writing these effects onto it too.
Worth noting too, just because of all the things we talked about, while this wasn't the most expensive recording studio in the world, even at the time, now they're way more, but even at the time, the Mutron biphase was not a cheap piece of equipment.
No.
By guitar pedal standards, it was insanely expensive because it was the
first
one to do that.
And in Jamaica, people did not have a lot of money then.
No.
Even today, like not a ton writ large, but like, yeah, there was not tons of funds to grab all this.
It makes me wonder where he got the stuff.
I would love to know that with the biphase in particular, because he's like legendary for using that thing. And it's like, rare. I can't imagine. I don't think he was looking at gear reviews on the internet and was like, this is the sound that I want. I feel like he must have like bumped into it somewhere and was like, I have to have that.
You don't think he was pulling up that pedal show and watching watching our boys over there?
So.
Okay.
But he did also like for that. It's of note that he like committed to like a limited range of gear, which I think is cool. Like Tom Morello from Rage Against the Machine did, where it's like, I have like 8 things and I know everything about them. Mm-hmm. Now I don't need like libraries of different crap. I just know how to make the sound I'm after with these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mostly mentioned that to illustrate, just for the people to understand that wasn't common. It was a very rare thing, even in its time, to have. And so the fact that he made that such a centerpiece of what he does is a very interesting like idea from his perspective, but it's also just like, how in the world did you get this thing? It's so weird.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I think like one last note that I have on it is that there are like producers out there who can record anybody. They could record Bob Marley, or they could jump in and do the Rolling Stones and then do Avenged Sevenfold. And you're like, you're great at understanding every element of this craft. I don't know that Lee Scratch Perry would be that guy.
Right.
Like, I don't think he could record Avenged Sevenfold without it sounding like Lee Scratch Perry recording Avenged Sevenfold. I don't think he could disappear if he wanted to. Maybe he could have. Who knows, right? But I think that's kind of a unique thing. Like, he had what he needed to do his thing, exactly what he was looking to do, and nothing different.
Yeah. Yep. And that's beautiful.
Mm-hmm. So those are my notes about Lee Scratch Perry. I hope you learned something.
I learned
Blake.
a lot. I really, really enjoyed that as a listener. I was like, wow, this is fantastic information. It gives me a lot to look at later. So yeah, this is I really enjoyed that a lot. This is going to be a lot of fun. I expected this to be fun. I think it's going to be more fun than I was even thinking it was going to be.
I can't wait. And I promise to those of you out here, I won't only be talking about Jamaican music. But it will come up again.
It won't be the last time.
Yes.
For sure. No, we're going to go into some weird territory. I've got a really fun topic. Well, maybe fun's not the right word. I have a really interesting topic for next time. And I think maybe we'll figure out a more official sign off later, but I think that's a good place to wrap this up. What do you say?
Hey, it works for me, man. Thanks for listening to me talk your ear off about music.
Can't
wait to do it again.
I hope we do it next week. So for everybody who's listening, this is the first episode. Thank you so much. I know every show you'll listen to or watch asks this, but if you could subscribe, if you could leave us a review, especially on these early episodes, it's really, really important.
Yeah, we're brand new. We could use it.
It's really hard to get the podcast off the ground. Trust me, I know. And those early reviews are immense in helping it kind of get forward and find its audience. So if you could do us a favor, if you liked this episode, drop it in whatever on the platform. They call it different things in different platforms. You know what to do. Wherever the words are, go leave those words. And wherever the stars are, give us as many as it'll allow you to give. So, thank you, folks. Thanks for sticking around. And I hope you enjoyed this. We're going to have a lot more for you. It's going to be a fun run. So talk to you all on the internet.